Hello and welcome to another Digital Photo Mentor live photo editing session. I am Darlene, your host for today as always, and today we are going to be doing winter photos. So you can see my old profile photo there, and we're going to be talking about the challenges of editing winter photos or images of sky of ice and snow. So even if you are in a part of the world where you don't get snow, if you're photographing anything that is frozen, you can create things such as things frozen in ice. We're going to be talking about those unique challenges today. So without further ado, let me get into the images and we'll get started. Oh, I'm sneezing. So literally sneezed. Hello, everybody. Let's see who is here. Sheila, I've got some of yours. Does not look like winter today. Well, that's maybe a good thing. It does look like winter around here. Alaska. Another sneeze. I only had two. They always come in threes. Alaska should have some snow as well. Brandon, greetings from Calgary. I saw that you got my email that you had won something, Brandon. So congratulations on winning that. Everybody who had purchased both the Luminar Neo course and our portrait course was eligible for a draw. And 4 people got their names drawn, and one of them was Brandon. So congratulations. Karen, Grand Canyon. Oh, Grand Cayman. Sorry, Grand Cayman. Nice. That's a nice spot to be. Vicky's in Edmonton, California. Ray, nice to have you. Dave in Ottawa. Danelle, thank you. Bless me. No, definitely not wintry in Cayman, and definitely not in Boca Raton. It shouldn't be cold in Boca Raton. All right, so I'm going to get started. So some of the questions that you guys had, or the people who submitted their images had, was about the absence of saturation in winter photos and how to make them punchier. So let's take a look at some of those challenges here. All right, the first one, let me just change my screen here. So make that bigger. There we go. And Rob should be here shortly. He's running an errand. So I think he's going to pick up some farm eggs for us. All right, so the first one is I'm going to do your images, and I've got them categorized based on the software that the person that submitted them prefers to work in. So I've labeled them as yellow for Lightroom and blue for Luminar. And then Sheila said she uses both, so I've kind of indicated hers as green, which ironically is if you mix yellow and blue together, you get green. So when we get to Sheila's, we can take a pick. So this is one of Deb's images, and she's got these really cool ice flows. Maybe while I'm working on one of these, Deb, you could tell us where you photographed these, because it's really interesting. So the first thing I always do, so I'm going to go through the same process that we always do, which is, I'm trying to make this smaller here. Let me just get rid of this panel. There we go. Is the color profile, right? So in this case, we are dealing with Nikon camera profiles. Okay, so that's an NEF or a Nikon file. We can see her exposure here if you want to check out what settings she used to take this image. And then we can see the Nikon profiles here. Okay, so remember, I've talked about this in the past. Landscape ones tend to enhance blue and green. So in this case, we're going to get more color out of that water and the sky if we choose landscape versus one of these others that is more flat. Okay, notice portrait actually brings out the color as well. So we could start with one of these. We could start with landscape. It's adding a fair bit of contrast though. So I don't mind the portrait one because it's bringing that color out. And we'll see what happens as soon as we start making some of these other changes as well. Okay. So I am using my keyboard shortcut. Sorry, give me a second here. I'm just going to... I don't want to sniffle on camera. So I'm going to disappear for a second just so I can deal with my sniffly nose. So Okay, I'm back. All right, so let's start with a usual. We're going to do shift double click on the white slider and the black slider. And you can see immediately what's happened here. So pop the white slider. Oh, I need my little mouse cursor. It's popped the white slider up to plus 64, right? So if we just do undo on this, let me just go back 2 steps, and we take a look at the histogram, right? When you're photographing winter, you have to pay really close attention to your histogram because you should have most of the scene in the upper part of the graph or on the right side of the graph, okay? Because most everything should be light tones. And right now, everything is spiking gray in the mid, okay? Because that's what your camera meter tries to do. Your camera meter tries to make gray. And I actually have an article on that. Let me try and find that. And I'll send you a link to that. So what your camera meter is doing is trying to make medium gray. Okay, so when it measures things, it's measuring the light bouncing off of the subject. In this case, the white snow. Okay, I've got that article for you. So you want to use exposure compensation in this case to make sure that you are setting your white to be white, not gray. Okay. Lemon and ginger. Honestly, Sheila, it's just morning allergies. I usually sneeze. Well, it's not morning anymore, but I usually sneeze the first part of the day. And Deb says, glacier at the back of the lake, Portage, Alaska. Very cool. Very cool. Okay, so where did I leave here? Okay, so when I do the whites and the blacks, okay, so it's going to set the white point over here on the graph. So it's going to make sure that I have pure white and pure black. And we can use the Alt Option key to check it. See, there's just a tiny little bit of clipping. If I go a little farther, right, the mountain starts to clip. So I'll just keep that in check right there. I might actually go a little farther and then bring the highlights down, or we can deal with that spot there. Right? We can also work on just this area as an object. Right? Let's make sure we have some black. So lack of color was another one of the issues or questions that people had about winter photos. Right? So I'm just going to boost the shadows a bit here so we can lift the shadows. You see what that's doing? Right? It's actually doing a really good thing. And possibly exposure as well, because remember, that's our midtones. See, now look where the histogram is shifting, right? Can you see it's shifting more to this side, right? So I'm going to go back and check the whites again after I've done all that. Make sure it's not gone too far, right? So there's a quick before and after. So one of the reasons why the winter photos that you're taking might be dull is they're underexposed, okay? Hello from Ireland. Welcome, Catherine. That's exciting. Right, so picking that up right away. Now we can do some things like add clarity and texture, but I don't want to do that in the sky, perhaps. Let's just see what it does. So this is a case where I'm going to take the clarity slider far because I want to see what 100 does versus 0. So it's actually doing some really nice things. So let's take that up part way. And then in terms of texture, do we want to texture everything? Now, if we do everything, the water gets really textured as well as the mountains and this glacier here. So I think I want to just texture the glacier and bring some attention to that, leaving the water a bit smoother. Okay, so there's a few ways that we can do a selection on that. Now let's take a look at this image upside down. Okay, so I'm using Command square bracket key to turn it upside down. And let me just move it over so that you can see the whole image. When we look at it upside down, where does your eye go? Okay, let me get rid of the side stuff. Where does your eye go? I'm assuming that. Oh, Rob is picking up beef. Sorry, I thought you were getting eggs, Rob. I told him you were getting eggs. So where does your eye go here? Right? I'm assuming that the glacier is where you want the eye to go, and the mountains are actually some really nice leading lines, pointing to the glacier, but because it's darker, your eye goes to these bright spots on these mountains. Okay, so we're going to tone those down a bit. Okay, so again, remember to look at your image upside down when you're working on stuff like this. Okay, so now we can do some local adjustments. Okay, everything we've done so far is global. Now we're going to do selecting local adjustments. So I'm going to start by just choosing select subject under the masking tools and see what Lightroom picks. Okay, so that's not bad. It's close, but I also want to pick up this part and the part in the water, and maybe even this part over here as well. Okay, so I'm going to add to it, and there's a few different ways that you can add. Okay, I'm going to add using object, and then I'm just going to use the paintbrush tool that's part of the object selection and paint over this part here that I want to include. Okay, it might have a hard time picking up the difference between the water and this glacier bit. Okay, so let's just see how well it does. Okay, that's not bad. Okay, look at how much it picked up. It just missed a little bit there and a little bit there. So I'm going to do add again. And this time I'm going to use a brush, and I'm going to try auto mask. And let's just see if it can find the edges. If it's not perfect, that's okay. If I get a little bit of water, that's okay. But I want to get most of this ice. Okay, that looks good. Now that I have the mask that I want selected, now I can adjust it. Okay, so now I can brighten it even more. Right, and if we want to make sure there's no clipping, right, when you're in the masking tool, the Alt key doesn't do anything on the sliders. It won't help you. Okay, so J key on your keyboard will show clipping. So if I go too far, you'll see that I get white clipping. Okay, so I'm going to bring the white up again, just enough until I get that area that's clipping. Okay, I'll bring the exposure back down. Highlights. So it's this dance, right? White's up, highlights down, like so. Okay, shadows up, and you can see that we're definitely brightening this whole iceberg thing here. Okay. Now, remember, we want color. So if you want color, what do you need to do? Add some black. Okay, look at what happens when I do that. It brings out all these beautiful blues in here. Okay. We can also intensify it if we want to shift the color, right? We can add some blue, like so. So we can add just a tiny bit of blue. And if we want a tiny bit of saturation, don't go too far, okay? Don't go crazy. And this is where I want to use texture, okay? So this is where I'm going to take the texture. Let's zoom in a little bit here. Of this up higher, because I want to pick up the texture of that ice. Can you see the difference? This is minus versus plus. Now there's all this beautiful texture in this ice, okay? I can bring the clarity up a little bit more if I want, but keep in mind that when you add clarity, it adds contrast as well. So if you're increasing the clarity, you might have to go back and do less black, okay? So let's see what that's doing. Okay, so I'm going to name this. I'm just going to call it iceberg. I know it's not an iceberg, it's probably a glacier, but I'm just going to call it iceberg. So if we turn it off, see the difference? Okay, it's really punching up all those things. And we're not punching up the water, okay, because we didn't want the texture of the water to come out. Okay, now I'm going to do another one, and I'm going to do the sky. Right, and here we can darken the sky. But I want to make sure those clouds stay white, so I'm going to keep the whites. Okay. We could also, if we want to add some darkness, okay, we could add this area here too, but I don't want to punch up the whites. So let's just do the sky, like so. And then I'm going to do select object, and I want to get this mountain area here, just this bright area. Actually, no, I'm going to undo that. I'm going to do a luminance mask to get the bright areas. Okay, so that's going to be this white part here. Okay, and then I'm going to do a subtract subject because I don't want it to pick any part of the iceberg. Okay, so now you see I've got the brightest areas in the sky. I can refine it with this slider here. Let me get back to Luminance Mask. I can refine it here. And if I don't want the parts of the sky, I can subtract sky as well. So now I've got just the white parts of the mountains, right? And it looks like I did get a little bit of this iceberg, but let's just see what happens. So I'm going to just darken exposure a little bit. Okay, so see how it takes away that bright area, bring the highlights down away. So it's not still, it's still white, but it's not taking away from the iceberg. Okay. I forgot to label this one sky. And then this one is going to be, let's just call it the mountain. Okay. So if we take a look at what the masks are doing overall, okay, so there's off and on. Okay, so this is the kind of editing that you can't do in camera, right? You can't select one object to brighten it in the camera. Okay, so this is the power of photo editing. You get to select which things you are enhancing. Okay, I'm going to dial this brightness of the iceberg back just a little bit. Finding it's looking a little bit too much standoutish. It looks like it was obvious that I've edited it. Okay. Then I'll just brighten the whole thing again. So now that I've done my masking, I want to come back and check all of these things. Okay, so there's tiny little bits. I don't know if you can see that here. I'm going to zoom in. There's tiny little bits clipping, but I'm not so worried about that. I mean, it's just literally highlights on the snow. Okay, so I'm not too worried about that. I'm going to check the black, make sure we have some good blacks. Okay, and that looks pretty good. The one thing that I would have suggested, Deb, when you're photographing this is to watch the edges of your image because you're missing the top of this mountain. Right? So I'm actually inclined to crop it out because it looks like it's a mistake. Okay, so I'm going to crop this one a little bit. And you've got a lot of foreground, so I'm actually going to go skinny, and let's just do it a little bit more panoramic. Okay, so I'm coming in obviously on the mountain, okay, so it looks like I've cropped on purpose. So be very careful. Okay, now I'm looking at this little spot here. Okay, again, I'm always looking at the edges, so I'm looking at that little spot there, and I want to crop that out as well. So I want clean edges. Like so. Okay. So there's our before and after. And this one over here is actually really bright, and I might even select it or deselect it from this iceberg. Okay. So if I look at the mask, I think I'm going to subtract this one because I want the edge of the image to be a bit darker. Okay. So I'm just going to subtract that. Like so. Okay. To get the mask to show, I'm pressing the O key on the keyboard. Okay. So now it's not as obvious there. So my eye still comes into the middle. Everything is about bringing your eye into the middle. Okay. You see that? And then I might add a final edge vignette, okay, which is in our effects panel. So just darkening the edges. Remember, feather down to 0, set your shape and where it's positioned. Okay. Then set your feather back up higher. Make sure on this one you keep the highlights slider up, okay? Because when you do that, if you darken and you have the highlight slider down, it's making the highlights equally as dark as everything else, and they should have a bit more. It keeps the highlight being a highlight, okay? So let's just do ever so subtle, like so. So there's our before, right? Remember, dull because it's underexposed. Now look at the histogram, okay? Look at the difference with the histogram. Let me just make a quick copy here. Okay, so I just made a virtual copy, and I'm just going to reset it because I want you to look at the histograms. Okay, so look at this histogram. Everything is clumped over to the left, right? So it's middle and left, meaning everything is medium gray or darker. And then now, most everything is either in the middle or brighter. See, the spikes here are more towards the bright side. And in fact, I might even bring the exposure up even more. Okay, like so. There we go. Now, we still don't have any highlights clipping. So if we look at this exposure, see, I'm about a 1 1/3 stops underexposed. So really watch your camera settings and your histogram when you're doing windows. Sheila says I'm in her head when you're editing, and watch your edges. So take that a step farther, Sheila, and put myself in your head when you're shooting. Watch the edges, because if Deb had seen that when she was shooting, she could have zoomed out a little bit more, or backed up a little bit more, or just angled the camera a little differently to get the top of the mountain. Right? I think this is a good crop as well, but it would have been nice to have the top of that mountain to keep it in there. Right? All right, so now that we've got one image done, and she's got something that's kind of similar, right? Really cool subject matter. Let's see what we can do about copying and pasting, okay? So we've done some masking. When you've done some masking, again, this is why to name things, right? So when I name these, okay, I don't have mountains in the other one that I need to tone down. So I am going to do the iceberg and the sky. And let's just see what happens. So I'm going to copy everything. I don't want the cropping as well, okay? And usually I don't want healing, okay? So we'll just leave that unchecked. I didn't do any cloning or healing, but you want to usually not copy that one. And then I'm going to paste it into this one. And you can see that it's taking its time. It's analyzing the image for the AI, okay? And now let's go look at what it selected as the iceberg, okay? So sky, got selected as sky, right? That looks pretty good. But the sky is being darkened here, and I don't think that that's necessarily a good thing, okay? Because the sky was already fairly dark. But let's come back to that one, okay? The iceberg, okay, what's been selected here, if we look at each one, okay, so that's the subject. That's the object that I added. Okay, the brush is obviously not going to do anything correct here. It's making a streak here, so I'm going to delete that one. So that's the brush. Oops. No, I want to delete it, not hide it. And then the object that I minused was over here, this tiny little bit over here. So I don't need that one either. So, oops. I keep hiding it instead of deleting it. There we go. So now we've got this part of the iceberg selected. And once again, I just might want to select more, right? So here you get to choice. You can decide how much of it you want to highlight. Okay, so if I'm going to go add object, I might use the square. Let's use the square. And I'm going to select all this bits in the middle. And let's just see what it picks. Okay, it only added a few more. I want to get these guys. It didn't add what I wanted. So I'm going to use the brush. Oops. I meant object. Oh my goodness. Now I've just made a mess here. I don't want brush. There we go. Okay, so we're going to add objects. And I'm going to use the brush. So add object. I'm going to brush in these bits of ice here and the middle ones. And let's see how it does. So it's still sort of selecting bits and pieces, but it's not too bad, right? See how it's picking up look at what it's doing there, because I've brightened that so much. But remember, I added blue, right? So maybe we don't want to add the blue in, because it's gone kind of a weird color, right? It's also got this kind of halo around it because it's selecting the top part. So I'm not crazy about this selection overall, and the copy and paste didn't work so good. So I'm actually going to just start over again. And what I'm going to do is start with the sky and invert it, right? So I'm going to take this same mask and do duplicate and invert. Okay, so now I've got all the icebergs, and I just have to minus the mountains. So when you're doing these masking, you just kind of have to figure out what's the best way to approach it. So now I'm just doing object minus. So I'm going to minus the mountain, And I'm going to subtract object again and just paint over this mountain. Okay, so what I'm going to do is again bring out the texture in the iceberg and the color. I missed a little bit there, but that's okay. So now I've got most of the ice selected. Let's punch up the whites. There we go. I've got the J key active. Brighten it a little bit. And again, make sure we have blacks. Okay, so the black is what makes the ice sparkle. See that? We can give it a bit more blue, but I don't want to go too crazy because the image overall is fairly monochrome, but we can just give it that tint of blue, right? We can also go back and give the entire image a bit more blue. Okay, so we can dial this whole thing down. Okay. The selection here still isn't great. There's some sort of like a weird outline here, and it could be that we're getting some chromatic aberration. So let's check that off. Yes, did you see that? Okay, so what I was seeing was this fringe at the top here. See that green outline? I'm zooming way in here. Can you see that green outline? Right? And it was a chromatic aberration. So literally checkbox, and that is solved. Right? So look for those kinds of things on the edges of stuff. But I find that the overall image is still a little bit dull, and I'm not crazy about this sky being darkened, so I'm actually going to delete it. And let's just make sure we've got some good blacks, make sure we've got some white, like so. Okay, so overall, again, we're doing the same thing. We're brightening the whole image, and we added only a tiny bit of blue into that iceberg or ice. Okay. Why did I not get precisely the mountain by using auto detect? So do you mean when I did the paintbrush rate or using the object select? Which one was I using? I got a pretty good selection. So when I did this one here, when I did invert and I did minus the object, I didn't get here. It's because this area, I think you mean this area here, I didn't get a perfect selection. And you can see there's a little bit of the mask here. And I think it's not perfect because there's very little definition between the mountain and the sky. Okay. When I was using the paintbrush. Okay, I didn't use the paintbrush on this one. I used select object. So there's two different things. Okay, so there's a mask with just a paintbrush, like here. Okay, and then there's mask object. And when you select object, okay, so if I do this one again, okay, so if I want to subtract from this mask, I can use subtract brush. And you mean this one here, auto mask, right? Okay, so if I have auto mask on, what it's trying to do is it's trying to find the edges of things. But as you can see here, I mean, it's doing a better job here if I paint, but the edge is very undefined, right? The mountain and the clouds blend together. So that's why it's having a hard time finding it. Okay, so when you're using the auto mask here, the auto detect, it's just having a hard time finding the edge. See, so I can do that on this edge and not get the sky. Okay, like so. And let me just dial this down a little bit here. Does that make sense? Did that answer your question, Ray? Yes, auto mask. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at something different. So let's go over to some of the Luminar ones, okay? So I wanted to bring up Lena's because she asked the same question, right? So she asked about color in the winter photos. Why can't I get saturation? Okay. Danelle asked a question. I'm missing some of my question. Okay, so Danelle asked, why did I reduce black when you increase clarity? Because when you increase the clarity, let me just go back to that image. Okay, so I'll use this one for example. When we increase the clarity, it increases contrast, and it does that by adding black. So it's kind of doing the same thing, right? In this case, look at the clarity. That actually did a really nice job, right? And I could do that on just the ice. But when you increase clarity, it adds more black. So all I did was just compensate because I didn't want that much contrast. Okay, so it's that dance between two things that are doing similar things to the image. Does that make sense? Okay. Would I consider a sky replacement for this image due to the foreground? Possibly, but honestly, a sky replacement is going to be tricky on this one because of the difference with the cloud and the sky and the cloud going over the mountain. You're going to have a hard time getting a nice clean sky replacement. And the lighting is very soft and clean here, soft and nondescript. So you wouldn't have a bright sunny blue sky. So it wouldn't make any sense to change the sky per se. So I didn't come into my head on this one. No. I agree, Janelle. I liked what the clarity did there as well. And I could go back in here to the mask, right? If I want more on just the ice, because I didn't add any texture. And so I could go and add some more texture to that ice. Yeah, so look what that's doing. That's really cool, right? If I zoom in, look at this ice. Look at how shiny it looks, right? Do you see how shiny it looks? So let me do the before, right? After. That's what that's doing. That's why you want nice highlights and shadows. Great questions. Okay, so going back to Lena's question about the color, and she wants this one done in Luminar, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so the issue with this biggest issue with this one again is, look, exposure. Okay, now I can do this really quickly in here without changing any profiles or anything, just by doing my shift double click trick, right? So look what happens. Immediately we get the graph spread out. Haven't changed the exposure at all, but now we have some actual white in the image. So I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to edit it in Luminar because that's her image of choice. So I am going to do the raw file. So I'm opening the source file directly into Luminar. Okay. So normally if you're working in Luminar as a standalone, you wouldn't have to do that. You just open the image and off you go. Okay. But I did this because I wanted to be able to access develop raw. Sorry, my mouse has got cat hair over it. my mouse stops working, and I know Sheila and I talked about this. I have to clean my mouse out periodically because it's full of cat hair. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is develop raw, and we can see about camera profiles, and indeed, this is where you'll find the camera profile in Luminar. Indeed, we have some, so I could try landscape, and you can see it did make a difference. But we need to correct this histogram, and then I can come back and play with this, right? So there's a couple of different ways I can do that. There isn't a nice shift double click trick here in Luminar. We can use the black and the white sliders, or we can use the curves. Okay, the curves tool is one that is a little bit more complex to use. And I'm going to see if I can find the video that I did on curves while I'm talking about this. So I'm trying to find stuff while I'm working here. So usually this is Rob's job to do this, but let's just see if I can grab this. And where's my, how do I share it? Here we go. All right, I got it. I think Rob is back in his office. So here's a video I did on curves. So that will help you, and I'm going to show you how to use that. Okay, so the histogram shows up here in the curve tool as well, and we can see that the farthest the data goes is here. Okay, so this is the brightest spot on the image, but it's not white. It should be over here. So to fix that, it's really easy with the curves tool. You just grab this spot on this slider on the right here and just keep dragging it until they meet. See that? And we're getting closer. I'm still watching this histogram up here. And if I turn on my clipping warnings, that's the J key on Luminar as well. I have to go farther. There we go. So it looks like it's going off. My point has gone farther here. But you can see it's touching the edge of the graph now, and I'm just getting clipping in the sky. So I'm going to go just until I get clipping right there. Right, now I'm going to come back and revisit this camera profile. Right, the standard, right, this is what it was, Luminar default. You can look at landscape. There's not a whole lot of difference here, so let's just go with the landscape one. Now we also want to add some blacks, right? So I still have the clipping warnings on and there's no black. So I'm going to do the same here. And now you can you see the clipping starting to happen, right? That's that blue highlight there. I don't want that much, but let's just bring it back a little bit, right? Now I can turn the clipping warnings off, close the histogram, and now I can play with things like contrast. And remember, exposure brings up your midtones, right? So exposure is brightening those midtones. And as soon as I do that, it's pushing everything off the edge of the graph. So I either need to go back and adjust my curve and just back off a little bit. Okay, so that's the same dance that I was doing with clarity and blacks. Okay, so when you pull one slider, it's going to affect other things. So you have to be aware of that. Okay. So I brought the exposure up, which is the midtones, and it also pushed the highlights too far. Okay. So that looks pretty good. I still got some black, keeping that. So the important thing is to keep the amount of black in your image. You do want some clipping on the black because otherwise that's why your image looks less colorful, right? The only place that you can find the white balance sliders in Luminar is in here in the develop panel, right? Rob is in the house. Elvis is in the building. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do, oh, my mouse just quit on me. There we go. Oh, I got to get my mouse back. Sometimes these wireless mouses, they lose the connection. So there we go. I just have to tap it on my desk. So I'm going to dial the temperature down, or we can try one of the presets. So I'm going to go with daylight because it's set to something a bit warmer. So if you want your winter scene to feel colder, add more blue. Okay, so lower the temperature. I find it's really pink now, so we can try the eyedropper. There we go. Okay, so the eyedropper, I know, remember Holly was saying that it wasn't working, and it is now working again. So if we use the eyedropper, our snow should be white, right? So we pick the eyedropper and click on the snow, and that should come up as white. Okay, now you notice how it got really warm, right? So obviously this may have been taken at sunset, which is why it's kind of warm. So if you want your winter images to feel colder, keep the temperature down a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to go somewhere in there. Yes, I can see that you're here, Rob. Okay, we can add a little bit of sharpness here. And then we can go in and add some smart contrast if we want more contrast. Right? Like so. But be careful of going too far. Again, we want to make sure we're not losing our highlights. So I'm constantly doing this balance of adjusting one thing and then going back and adjusting the next thing. Okay? So that's develop. The next thing I might try in this case is the enhance AI and using the accent AI. Okay, so I'm going to drag this one up, which is also going to increase the contrast. Again, see it's clipping a little bit. And I don't mind if that part of the sky clips. Okay, so clipping means no detail, right? So if I increase this accent AI, and let's see about the sky. So see how it's bringing out more blue in the sky now? See what that's doing? And it's also bringing out these footprints in the path here, which I think are really great, right? So the next thing I want to do is bring out some more texture, like I was just doing with the one on the iceberg. And the tool for that in Luminar is the structure tool. Okay, so bring it all the way up, and you'll see what happens. You get lots of this great structure stuff, but I don't want this happening in the sky because you see what's happening. It's picking up some noise, right? So I'm going to bring the structure slider up quite high, and I'm going to take boost up quite high just to show you, what it actually is doing. Okay, so if we look at this, it's picking up tons and tons of detail. Okay, before, after. but I only want it in certain places. So I'm going to just paint it in, right? So I'm going to use the mask here, and I'm going to use the brush. And now it's great when you use the brush in Luminar as a paintbrush, because you can see it's got the plus. And if I hit X on my keyboard, now it has a minus. So minus is erase, plus is paint. So that's really handy. I actually wish Lightroom had that. So I'm going to paint at about 70% opacity. And I want to add that structure into the path. Maybe a little bit here in the middle and a little bit in this tree. Okay, because I don't want it in the sky because it was making a lot of noise. Okay? So you can see that it's only applying in this middle section. See that? Now once I've applied it, I can go and dial it back a little bit because I've gone too far. So I take the sliders to the extreme on purpose, then I paint it where I want it, then I dial it back. Okay? This is actually a really pretty image. Question here. A couple of questions. Okay, looks like the light is casting long shadows on it from the front, on the fence of the sun. Probably the sun is at an angle like sunrise or sunset. Possibly, yes. So if we look at where the shadows are here, right? So if I zoom in, there's definitely some light coming from this side. It's not super contrasty though, right? Like we're not getting a lot of shadow. I don't see a defined line of shadow. So definitely it could have been later in the day because the light seems kind of soft. Yeah. Long shadows, you're right. Does Luminar have a counterpart to Lightroom's color grading? If so, would it work for a scene like this? Yes, it does. So I will do that. Okay, so let's take a look at that. And that was Steve's question about the long shadows. So it looks like Steve got his Facebook thing figured out, or he moved over to YouTube to watch us. Okay, so that's good with the structure, right? To color grading. Okay, so color grading, if you want to do color grading, that is down in the creative tools under toning, okay? With Lightroom now, you have options of doing highlights, midtones, and shadows. And with Luminar, you just have the highlights and the shadows. Or we could use the mood tool, which allows you to apply a LUT, which you can't do in Lightroom. Okay, so we could do something in here that we can't do in Lightroom. Okay, so let's take a look at the toning tool first. Okay, so if I want more blue in the shadows, for example, we can choose shadows, and then you won't see anything happen until you bring the saturation up, and then choose the hue. So we could pick something bluish, like so. Right, so see how that actually makes it look more wintry. Right, it looks like there's frost on the trees, so that's kind of cool. And then if we want our highlights, for example, to be warmer, like we want to pick up the warmth in the sky, like so. Okay, I'm going to take this to just an extreme, just so you can see what it's doing. So before and after. Let me take it more extreme. I'll find the right blue here. There we go. Okay, so you can really see before, after. So it's giving it, I'm getting too much warmth, I think, from the highlights. Let me turn that down. There we go. It's giving it like a two-tone look, which is what toning is all about. So it gives you more wintry feeling, but you still have that little bit of yellow and warmth in the sky. So I kind of like that. I'll dial it back just a little bit. Right? I like keeping everything subtle. Right? So let's do a before and after. So remember the original was underexposed and very flat. But look at, there's no color. Now, do we have some color? Yes. Partly because we've added the contrast and the blacks, and that will help you have more color. But also things in the winter are more monochromatic. Okay? So try not to put color where there isn't color. Okay? So Rob has asked everybody if they could do a Google review. Thanks very much, Karen, for doing that. Give this video a thumbs up today as well. Word of mouth spreads. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that with your Camera Club members. If you are a Camera Club member, please do that. Bit of haloing around the tree. Let's have a look. I think it's probably just when I'm zoomed out. It looks okay here. Do you see it now, Kelly? Does it look okay when we get it to load? I think it's okay. Looks sharp. I think you're just seeing the actual cloud structure. That's literally just the cloud. It's dark in that area. Okay. What else might I do on this image? We could definitely add a vignette as well, just to darken this front area. So if I'm going to add a vignette, I'm going to do the same thing. And we can actually go with a light vignette on this one if we want. So if we want to do something like this, right, and make it more sort of, let's not go quite so far, sort of misty feeling. Okay, we could do that. Am I not going to add mystical? Well, you know, Holly, you know, I was getting there. You're just ahead of me. Or we can just darken the edges a little bit. Okay? Now, the benefit of the Luminar vignette is that we can move it around. Okay, so I just want to darken the bottom part here, and I don't want to darken the sky. So I'm actually going to keep the vignette larger, and then I'm going to move it up. Okay, so I want to keep this part, this corner. I want to keep this corner not getting any of the vignette. So I want to keep it like that. So see, I'm just vignetting this bottom and then this corner. And now when I bring my feather back up, see, can you see I'm vignetting off center now? So just the front part of the path here. So again, keeping our eye into the center. Okay, so you want to make sure with your vignettes that you don't do stuff like that's visible. Okay, so you don't do that. You can see it. Okay, so just don't go overboard and go too far. That looks pretty good. So it doesn't look like there's anything there, right? If we turn it off, subtle. That's what we're going for. Okay. Am I going to add mystical? Yes, of course. And Danelle has a great point. So yes, if I want to do the same thing in Lightroom, you use a radial filter, a radial mask. Exactly. Looks like an antique wintry scene. That's not a bad thing. A snowflake overlay. Well, I don't have any of those, Holly. Kind of a specialized niche. I don't know if that's something that people would want. But why don't you create one and let us know how that works out. Okay. So I could add mystical. And I've actually been using, dare I say it, glow more lately than mystical. If we want to make it more sort of antique looking, we could try mood and pick a lot. So I'm going to change the amount up higher here. And then when I pick a lot, okay, we've got several custom ones. And again, these are ones that I downloaded or came with the ones that came out with the Ukraine LUTs, the Freedom LUTs. So these ones have some blue and orange. I know some of these ones with the Ukrainian names. Ooh, that's kind of interesting. Hey, look at how much it brings up the orange in the sky. So that's actually kind of cool. That's actually really cool. Okay, so let's keep that one in mind. I'm not even going to pretend to know how to pronounce it. Okay, a lot of these have blue in them, so we're not getting those dual colors. But that's why I went to these Ukrainian ones, because I know that they have sort of blue and orange. Ooh, that one's kind of cool too. So see how that one's cooling the image off, right? That one feels more like blue hour now, right? Versus, let's go back to the other one. Which one do we like better? Okay, give me a vote. Do we like the one that looks like sunset? This one. So Dnipro. I don't want to murderize that name. Or Kharkiv. Again, I'm probably murdering that name too, right? More blue. So tell me in the chat, do we want to see it more sunset-y or more blue hour? That one almost looks monochrome, right? That one's warm as well. Notice it's adding a crunchiness. So that one's similar to the other one that we were looking at. And that one's almost monochrome too. So I think it's definitely between these two. Let's see. So blue hour. blue, Dnipro, Kharkiv, blue, Kharkiv. So it seems to be split. Looks like more blue hours. Okay, so it looks like we're getting more of the blue hour vote. So let's go with, which one was that now? I think it was Kharkiv. Oh, Kharkiv. So everybody's voting for the blue one. Okay, so unfortunately, Holly, I think you're voted out. Everybody likes the blue one. And monochrome does have something to say too. So this actual image would look good in monochrome, the whole thing. Now, with the mood, right, I can decide how much strength to apply and how much saturation of the actual light to apply. Okay, so we can decide there. So there's our blue hour. Right? Do we want more contrast or less? Let's try that. I'm keeping the contrast down just to keep it softer. Okay? I don't want to go too crazy with it. So there's our blue hour. Right? Now we can also decide to mask it if I wanted to. So if I wanted to keep that little bit more of yellow in the sky, I could actually just go in with the erase tool really subtly with my saturation or my opacity lowered and just give it a bit more warmth even down the middle here. Okay? So we could keep the warm colors in the sky and just on the path. Okay? Let me go with a higher opacity. So see the blue tone, keeping the sky a little bit warmer. Okay. And let's finalize. Oh, my mouse has quit on me again. There it is. Oh, there we go. So let me just try Orton Effect, because I've been liking Orton Effect a lot lately, especially on portraits. Okay? Notice how it tends to brighten things. So when you bring up Orton Effect, always bring the brightness down. Okay? So that definitely gives it a sort of mystical look, but it's a different look than mystical. So see what that's doing. Orton Effect tends to, I find, and this is going back to the film Orton Effect version, Orton Effects tends to make the black areas sort of glow. Okay? We could try Orton Soft. Okay. So let's go. I'm going to go with the Orton Effect on this one. And let's try Mystical just as a comparison. Okay. So I'm going to bring this one up. So it does kind of something similar. Right? So I kind of like Orton Effect on this one. So that's our before and after. Okay. Now there's still not a ton of color there, but keep in mind, what is the deal with mystical? Keep in mind that these types of scenes don't have a lot of color. Okay, so try not to get too stuck on we need to add some color if there's a scene that is actually more monochromatic. Well, the deal with mystical is that I use it pretty much on every photo for a long time, and I've kind of moved away from it, Holly. I've kind of played out my mystical, so I'm liking the Orton Effect these days. It was such a long process in Photoshop. Usually you had to have an action, you had to duplicate layers and add filters and do all these things. And now we have a slider. So how great is that, right? All right. Yes, according to our cat, she's on the verge of starvation. She's probably about to collapse and fade away completely, according to her. Cats are a little bit melodramatic. So now we can compare. Now, just for fun, I'm going to do a super quick edit here in Lightroom on this image. I'm going to pick the landscape just like we did as I'm talking here, okay, as we're doing our thing. And let's just see. I think I chose daylight and then got rid of some of the pink. So I could do a lot of work with masking on here to come up with something similar. But I really like what we created here in Luminar, right? It's got this really cool mystical feel. Now, the neat thing about this image, and I do this a lot with images, is flip them, okay? Actually, let me flip this one. Yeah, the texture and stuff is not really coming out in here at all. Or not getting the same beautiful texture that we were getting in the Skylum one, right? So I am going to, let's just try this here. I want to flip it, right? Let's just make a duplicate of this one. So I'm going to flip it this way. There we go. Right? So which way do you prefer it? Do we like this one? I kind of do, actually. Usually I prefer, because I feel like this path is coming in right here on the left and leading us in, right? Versus this way, it's actually leading us out because your eye wants to end here. So in this case, I don't like the flipped one. I prefer the original. Okay. Luminar is growing on Kelly. Awesome. Yeah, the flipped one, I don't like the flipped one either. It didn't feel right, did it, Karen? Like it just, there was something feeling about it, right? All right, let's see how many more I can do here. I want to do a few in Lightroom where I'm copying and pasting the settings. So Karen's here. Did you submit an image, Karen? I thought you did. No. Oh, Kelly has one. Let's do Kelly's. I like to try to do people's who's here. Okay, so this was Kelly's image, or is Kelly's image, and she is labeled as Lightroom, so I'm hoping that we're in the right program here. And this is a Canon file. So if we go and look at the profiles, we're going to see Canon profiles. So again, there's not much color here to begin with, honestly. So I'm actually going to choose portrait because it brings out some of these browns. And then we're just going to do our shift double click. But I want to lower the exposure before I do the whites, right? And I'm going to redo blacks and just double check that I have some clipping. So I'm going to lift the shadows, okay, and then lower the highlights. Now, I don't know how much texture, if any, there is to pick up in here. Right? Let's just see what happens. So if we bring up the texture, and I've got the spinny wheel. That's interesting. Okay, so look at clarity. See how it brings the contrast up as well as the actual clarity part and the texture. So what I'm looking at is, do we have any texture in here? And there is some. Okay, so I'm gonna make sure I keep those highlights down. There we go. So I want to keep this texture showing in this snow here. Okay. So that was a really quick edit, right? And I'm taking the texture, up to the nth degree here. And I might not want to do that on everything, so we could do a mask on the subject. So let's see what Lightroom thinks is the subject here. Interesting. Okay, so it thinks that is the subject. Okay, we can add to it. And I'm just going to do select object and paint over this area here. I should have used a bigger brush because I want to add some texture here. Definitely I should have used a bigger brush. So I'm not letting go of my brush. I'm painting with one connection. Okay? You can't stop and start. Okay, so it didn't pick up that. So that's the challenge with using the object thing, is it doesn't always get it. I'm just going to use the actual brush and get some of these snow and ice bits here. So I want to add texture to the ice flow, but not to the water. Okay. So now I've got the ice selected, and we'll crank up the texture. Okay, see the difference? I don't like so. All right. I would add a vignette on this one as well. Let's go medium. And in terms of color, there really isn't any. So this actually would be a great candidate for black and white. Look at, there's very little difference. Okay, so if we go black and white, when you use the color grading tool in Lightroom that somebody mentioned earlier, when you use that when you're in black and white, it becomes toning. Okay, so I can create a blue tone, right, like this. So blue in the shadows. And then we can put a warmer color, again, yellow. Nobody likes the yellow snow. Don't eat the yellow snow. And then we have sort of this split tone. Okay? Maybe even more burgundy. Oh, that's kind of cool. Okay. So what did you do with this one, Kelly? And I'm finding the top of this image is sort of, I don't want to see as much stuff up here. There's nothing for me here. So I almost want to come in and just take some of the top off, but I don't want to lose anything from either side because it's nicely framed here with this sort of waterfall coming down into this little pool. So I'm just going to come in from the top. Okay. The other thing we could do is actually I want to undo that. Let me just redo the mask, the cropping here. The other thing I could do is add a mask, and I'm just going to call this one Ice. I could add a mask, and I'm just going to do a linear gradient sort of on this top corner here. Like that. And I'm going to lower the texture, lower the clarity a little bit, and actually take the sharpness down. Okay, so see what that does? It's just minimizing that area at the top. That's just kind of uninteresting. Okay, it's just some sticks. So I'm minimizing what I'm seeing there. Okay, that's better. Is there a flip in Neo? Yes, there is. Yes, you can do that with the crop tool, Robert. And I have one of your images as well. So I will show that one next, actually. Yes, that's exactly what I did, Danelle. So I masked the snow areas, right? So with my mask, right, I selected just these areas here that are shown in green, right? That's where the mask is. And that's where I increased the texture and the clarity. Okay. So that's exactly what I did. Aha, so she did turn it black and white, but didn't think of color grading. So there you go. You say you can't stop and start. Oh, when you're painting the select object thing, Sheila, it has to be a one. As soon as you let go of the brush, it does its magic and selects the object. So when you're doing select object and you're painting, it has to be a one shot. She bumped up the water flow to brighten the highlights on the water. Okay, we could do that as well. And we can actually do that with just a paintbrush. Okay, so I can just use a really big brush and go in here to the water areas. Okay, and all I'm going to do is punch up the whites, like she said here, bring out that a little bit. Yep, that works good. Okay. Like so. All right, so let's answer Robert's question. You sent me these couple here. It looks like you're shooting through the door, right, of snow blowing outside. So you wanted to know how to punch that up, and you asked about flipping in Luminar. So let's do that, right? So I'm going to take this. Now, you don't have to do export or any of this stuff. You would just have your image in Luminar if that's your main program, okay? Ah, you pick them individually. Yeah. So I do everything the easy way, Kelly. I prefer to do things the easy way. Yeah. I don't like to make my life hard. Okay, so I'm going to answer your first question, Robert, is how to flip it. Okay, so that's in the crop tool. So right here, they make it super easy. There's a button. If we want, we can make it upside down too. Okay, so if we wanted to, we could flip this one, right? We can also do horizon alignment. So it's going to try and straighten the door. Okay. You can also, if you are in, I'm going to show you another tool. If you are in Develop Raw, okay, down the bottom under Transform here, we've got vertical alignments and things. Okay. So if we want to get this door vertical, right, we can combine the crop tool, but see how I just pressed this button here and the door is now vertical, okay? If I undo it, see what it's doing? It's straightening these lines so that everything is square like that, okay? You could also do a luminosity mask suggestion. Yes, absolutely, Danielle. If you do a luminosity mask, it will select all your highlights, but then you're going to select the highlights on the snow also. So that's why I just selected that area. Okay? So you could do a luminosity mask and then do intersect with and then paint around it. Okay, so you could say, I only want the highlights or the bright areas in this part of the image. I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so that is this image here. That is this one here. So let's get back in here. We're going to go back to our curve again to look at our histogram for the same problem. So you would want to know how to punch this one up. And same thing as the other one. It's too dark. So I'm bringing up this white slider until we see some clipping on the white. And I'm going to leave it just a bit lower, because I know I'm going to increase the exposure as well, which is going to do the same thing. Okay, so do that. And then I want to make sure that I have a little black. And I do have the clipping warnings on. That's the J key on Luminar as well. Rob, since you're here, could you please share the keyboard shortcut for Luminar Neo, or the link to the cheat sheet for the Luminar Neo keyboard shortcuts cheat sheet? That's a mouthful. Okay, so I'm adding blacks and whites to sparkle that up. Okay, we can also play with the color. Again, in here is white balance. We can try the eyedropper. It made it a little bit green, which is interesting. Let me try daylight. No, I'm not happy with any of these. I think it was the closest, actually, like that. The color that you had was actually pretty good. If anything, I'll give it a bit more magenta. Yeah, like so. The challenge with punching an image up like this is you're shooting through the door. So you've got the doorway, which is dark, right? And I wouldn't brighten it, but I would also change this crop to go freeform and get rid of some of the door. Right? It's just too much. So it's a great frame. So you're looking through it, right? But you don't need as much of it, and definitely not at the top. Okay, so I'm getting rid of some of the door. And then we have a little tighter framing. Okay? But the light outside is very flat, so it's going to be hard to punch anything up. There's not going to be any texture in here to get, right? So even if I bring structure all the way up, okay, you see there's no texture here. We're just starting to get grain. And that's just because there's no texture in the snow to pick up in the first place if it's just smooth. And the light needs to be going across it to pick up the texture. Okay, so Rob, if you could please share the article on the website on creating texture and how to shoot for creating texture in your images. Okay, so that's about as much punch as I could give this one. If we want to punch up this area a little bit more, we can use one of two tools. We can either do dodge and burn and use the lighten part. Anytime you're dodging and burning, bring your strength down to like 10 or 11. Never paint higher than that. And then I'm just going to lighten the snow up here. Right? So we want to bring attention to the snow that's flying off this roof here, like so. Right? And then I'm going to use darken. Also keep your strength way down. Right? And I'm going to darken the trees. And we could have done that by increasing the contrast as well. But I'm just doing a little bit of selective darkening. Okay? And I might even darken this whole railing. So that's how you get things to show up, especially something that's white like this, is you darken the stuff behind it. Okay? So if you have smoke, for example, and you backlight it, it's going to show up more. Okay? So see how that is picking up the snow more? Okay? Like so. So I hope that answers your questions on that, Robert. Going back to Lightroom. Let's see where I'm at. So similarly, the one that I did, the other one I did of Lena's, I would do the same thing here, right? And hopefully the Luminar, let's try it actually. Hopefully the Luminar remove power lines works on this one. Right? So let's try that. You're most welcome, Robert. Okay, so let's do always develop raw first. We want to set our camera profile. We want to set our color. And again, I'm checking the histogram. If you don't see the histogram, just go up to the view menu and it's right there. Right? Turn it off or on. It always appears at the top here, okay? With an exception. I'll show you that in a moment. Okay, so I want to check my curves. Okay, so this one, I don't need as much white. The exposure is really good. So in this case, I'm just going to use the white slider. And I've had that question a lot, is when do I use the white slider? When do I use the curve sliders? I use the curves when I want to go farther, right? And if I want to adjust the contrast manually, then I actually get into using the middle part of the curve. So here, I can take the white slider all the way up, and I'm still not getting any clipping, right? I've got the warnings on. Whereas with the curves, I get clipping right away. Okay, so I'm going to take this quite far, and then I'll just bring the highlights back down a little bit. So the exposure, notice I haven't touched the exposure, is pretty good. We just adjusted the contrast a tiny bit. Okay. Color, to me, looks good. I don't think we need to mess with the white balance here, but we can try it. Now, keep in mind, if we use the eyedropper in the shade, it's going to read that as more blue, and it's going to add yellow. So it's going to add the opposite color, okay? Look at that. Got warmer, okay? If we go in the sun, it's going to read yellow, and it's going to make the picture bluer. See that? Okay, so don't use the eyedropper in the shade. Make sure you pick a neutral object to click on, like snow, but don't do it in the shade because you'll get an over falsely blue reading and the picture will come out really warm or yellow. Okay? So we can do, actually that color looks pretty good. Okay? And let's try, I'm going to darken it a little bit now because I feel like overall it's actually too bright now. And then let's go try that erase tool and let's see if it gets the power lines. So click remove power lines, fingers crossed. I find that sometimes it finds the big wires like this and sometimes it doesn't, but this one should be fairly straightforward. Let's hope. And this is one of the cool things about the erase tool in Luminar that, of course, Lightroom doesn't have this. You'd have to paint it out. The new content aware spot removal tool is great in Lightroom. And if you have my Lightroom course, I did an updated lesson on that. Okay, so it removed part of it, but not all of it. Okay, so that's okay. We can actually work with that. I'm going to zoom in here. So if I want to try and erase the rest of it, I'm going to do it in bits. So if let's just do a section at a time. Yeah, it's not perfect, right? So I can just, if you make a mistake, you can just paint over it and do restore. So I'm going to get a smaller brush, first of all. And I'm just going to do smaller sections. Yeah, it's not working so great. So the erase power line didn't give me what I was hoping for. We could probably get this to work if I go little bit by little bit here. And that actually looks like part of the tree now. See that? Okay, so see how I just sort of do little parts? There we go. You gotta do it in little small bits. All right, let's just see what happens if I do the whole thing. Okay, so that's not bad. And then what I would do is just sort of do this to try and correct it so it draws in the branch, right? Now I'm just getting a big mess. Now I need to erase these branches. Okay, so the further I go, the more mess that I'm making. Yep, making a mess here. That's why I like this restore button. Restore is great. Let's try it again. It's definitely not perfect in this arena here. I'm not getting what I want over here because it's removing the branch. I think I'm just going to go in between like that. There we go. Closer. That's better. Anyways. It's not perfect, but I'm just going to go with that for now. And we partially erased that. I was kind of just testing to see if it would find it. And you see it found the part in the sky, but in the tree it had trouble with it because the tree looks like the power line, right? So the same thing I've done here, right? So look at the original is much bluer. Right? We can go back and add another blue LUT if we want. And there's not a lot to do on this one because it's pretty nice. Exposure was good, right? I usually like to turn the amount up on my LUTs just so that I can see the effect more. And these are some blue ones that I got from the Luminar, the Skylum website. Right, so these are all blue themed. I've got under custom. Let's try some of these. Woo! Blue velvet. That was kind of cool. Now look at how intense I've got the color, so I can just dial it back a little bit. Right? It's adding a lot of contrast. So I've got the contrast dialed down. But that's actually kind of nice. It's bringing out the blue in the sky really nicely. So that's a good LUT. I like that one. So not a lot to do here. We could definitely go in and add some structure. Right? You can also add details. So structure is like clarity in Lightroom, and details is more like sharpening in Lightroom. But with the details panel in Luminar, you actually have a lot more options. So I'm going to bring this clarity or this structure again way up, and I'm just going to put it in the trees. So I'm just going to paint it in. Let's go 100%. And I'm just going to add the structure to these trees here, okay, in the middle, and maybe a little bit to the snow, right? We could erase that box too, actually. Okay, so we're just getting structure in these foreground trees and the snow. Let's go back and erase this box here. See, there's a power box. Not adding to anything. And those are the kinds of things that if you notice that stuff, it will make your image just that much more streamlined and perfected. See, I did the stripe there. I did a little swipe here to try and get this shadow to line up well. That's better. Right? So I really like what that LUT did. And of course, we could add the mystical again, or let's try my new favorite, Orton Effect. Always bring the brightness down with Orton Effect. Yeah, I don't know about this one. This one I'm not liking the Orton Effect. Let's try Glow. So Glow actually makes things that are white glow more than the rest, okay? So see how it glows? Makes it look like it's snowing, actually. So that one's not bad. That gives a little bit of glow to the sky. Another one that I don't use a lot is Atmosphere AI, but let's try it on this one. Okay, so we can add fog, but does that make it look kind of smoky or snowy, right? Do we want to make it look like we're getting a bit of snow happening? Okay? So keep in mind that the fog can also look like snow. Not crazy about it. It's not my favorite tool, to be honest. So let's try Mystical in this case. Mystical's pretty cool. Let's just keep it low. There we go. I'm fairly happy with that. And I think I could clean up the trees and the power line a little better if I spent more time on it. So just take your time when you're doing erasings like that and go one at a time. With Luminar update the power line removal tool, I have little luck with it. I know that they are constantly updating things, Sheila. I don't know if they've updated that tool. It really depends on what you're applying it to, because I've had some images where I've applied it and it did an amazing job with some images that, like, things that had like crazy amounts of power lines, like India, think India, right? So there's our after image. So there's before and after. And we could do the same thing in Lightroom. So again, these are all just tools, right? The tools that we're using are Lightroom and Luminar, but you could literally use any software. So whatever you are using is just right. Okay? I have time for one more. So Sheila, which one of yours would you like to do? Because you sent me a plethora of winter images. Does anybody see one there that they would like to do? Now, this one you'd think is not winter image, but she's got icicles here on this fence. So it is, right? So does anybody have a preference for which one? Now notice that some of these have more color than others, right? This one has color. This one has color. That one might in the sky. We could bring that out. That's going to have some color. Actually, that one might be cool. Let's edit that one. This one definitely has some color in the sky. So does this one. And this one doesn't. Okay, so notice the difference in the lighting. The lighting is very flat here, very hazy, very snowy, versus here, right? Sun. Everybody's saying the one on the fence, the one on the fence. What do you guys think about this one? Because this is hoarfrost, and it's a very interesting phenomenon. I'm sure that you've seen that, Deb, where you are, and I think I can bring out some really neat colors and textures here. And Sheila, which do you prefer me to work in, Lightroom or Luminar? Because you've indicated both, and I know that you use both. So which is your preference? Somebody wanted to see the fence one in Luminar. Okay, let me see if I can do them both real quick. All right, so this one here, the first thing that I want to do, obviously, is the camera profile. But before that, I'm actually going to crop it, right? I've already decided that, Sheila, so I'm reading your mind. I'm going to crop it because I don't want this other part of the shore up here because it's white, right? Remember, white takes your eye away from things, the brightest areas. So I'm actually going to, like, straighten it a little bit. And then I'm going to come down and crop that part off. And I'm not worried about aspect ratio. I'm just going freeform here, okay? Like so. Okay, so immediately your eye goes more to the frost. And I think I maybe didn't have to tilt it either. So let's untilt. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to punch out the hoarfrost. Okay, the exposure, look at that, okay, is good. Let's look at our camera profiles. Okay, so in this case, look what landscape does, right? Punches up the contrast. We don't have a lot to do left, right? So I'm going to check the whites by doing the shift double click and the blacks. Now notice that it lowered the whites. Let's just see where we're at. So it is clipping a little bit, but I'm actually going to bring the exposure up and the shadows up a little bit, and then I'm going to bring these back down with the highlights. So notice that even if I bring the highlights all the way down, we're still getting some clipping, and that's just what's called specular highlights. So this is backlit hoarfrost, okay? So it's something that is white with backlighting on it, and you're going to get it being white. So I'm not too concerned about that. I'm going to add a medium edge vignette, which is one of my presets in my Lightroom pack, okay? And I'm actually going to lighten up the blacks a little bit more. I don't want to go so much black. It's feeling a little bit too contrasty for me. And I might go back and change this profile because I'm feeling like it's adding too much. Let's go standard. Okay, so I changed it back to standard. And I did that because I felt the landscape profile was just making this stuff in the back too dark. Okay. Let's try a white balance. Let's see what it thinks. So it definitely warmed it up a little bit, right? And in this case, I want to keep it bluer. So I like the idea of having it blue, and it was kind of a good color the way it was. So I like it like that. Now let's bring out some texture in this hoarfrost. And I also want to minimize the rock a little bit as well. So let's just do select subject and see what it picks. Okay, so it only picked part of the hoarfrost, right? So that's the challenge with the Lightroom subject selection, is it doesn't always get it, right? And I can't say select the thing with the best texture, right? So we could try object selection. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the square over the frost, and it did a better job, but it's still not picking up all of it, right? So that's the challenge. So let's try one more method. Let's do luminance range, and I'm going to come in to pick these brightest areas. Okay, see that? And then I'm going to do refine it a little bit, but I want to like deselect the background. So let's just see if I do subtract background. Yeah, see, it thinks that this is part of the background, so that doesn't work, right? So I'm either going to get these highlights in the background being picked up here on the water, or I have to manually brush them out. Okay, so I'm going to try brush. I'm subtracting, right? And I don't want auto mask. I just want to get rid of any masking bits on the background here. So I'm just painting quickly in between the hoarfrost. I don't want to get this bits of ice, these little bits here. So we tried multiple different auto selections, and the challenge here is that there's so much contrast in the background and the frost that it's picking it up as well. Okay, that's pretty close. If there's any that are problematic, I can come back and refine it later. And that's the beautiful thing about these masks, is this is all non-destructive editing, right? So we're not finalizing something and saying, okay, that's it. Now, the other thing I'm going to do here is I don't want to bring out the texture in the rock so much. So I'm actually going to go at 50% density on my brush. Okay, so remember we're subtracting. And I'm going to subtract 50% of this selection off the rocks. Okay, like that. Okay, now that I've got the selection, I just need to increase the texture and the clarity. Can you guys hear the cat howling in the background? She's howling. She does that sometimes after she eats lunch. Okay, so that looks good. And let's just call this one, oops, I don't want to delete it. I just got it selected. Frost. Okay. Let me zoom in a bit to see what this one is doing. Okay. So see, it's just picking up more of that texture on the frost. You can take it really far. Okay. I want to make sure I'm not clipping anything. You can bring the highlights down a little bit more. There we go. Now let's do another mask on the bottom. I'm going to do a linear gradient just like I did on the other one where I wanted to soften the corner. And this one, I just want to darken the bottom because I don't want the rock taking so much attention. Okay, so I'm going to lower the exposure and lower the highlights. See what that's doing? Munch. So here's our before and after. You see how much attention that rock is taking, especially in this bottom corner here? Right? Now she's in here. Okay, so now there's our before and after. Right? And that's why I kept the mask off of those bits in the background, right? Because I wanted to only get the frost. Now, the other thing I could do is because I went to the trouble of brushing all that stuff out, I could actually do duplicate and invert. So now I have everything but the frost. Okay. Now I can bring the highlights down even more. See that? On the snow and behind. And I can bring the texture down, and clarity down. So it's just kind of smoothing this background out. Can you see what that's doing? Like so. And we could actually even add some blue into it. We could add a bit more blue. Ooh, look at that. See what that's doing? Just ever so slightly. So there's our before and after. Trypophobia? Tell us about that, Brandon. I'm not familiar with that term. Trypophobia? I gotta Google that now. Tell me about that phobia, Brandon. I don't know what that means. Fear of snow? Fear of frost? Okay, and then the other one you guys wanted to see was the fence, and I have an appointment with Dan, actually, to talk about my Cuba tour, which is coming up, and I'm even wearing my Cuba shirt today. So I have a meeting with Dan right away, but I want to do this one, and we'll do this one in Luminar as requested. Okay, so even though it is a snow and ice photo, we still have a sunset, right? So I haven't even played with any presets, right? I've got tons of presets. There's lots of cool presets in here that we could try and see if it's doing anything. Ooh, warming sun. See, warming sun might be a really good one. It's still thinking. Nope, don't like that one. It's changing the sky. That one's not bad. We want to keep the warmth, right? Okay, so this one's added a lot of crunch. Ooh, winter refuge. Look at that. We have a winter preset. Well, that's kind of interesting, right? It's kind of giving a matte look, which is different. So I'm kind of not crazy about any of these. I'm just going to, oh, we're already at the original. I'm going to go and start editing myself. And I was going to show you something here. Okay, so once you've done your edit, so let's say we do some edits in here and we make some changes. Ooh, landscape's really red. Not crazy about landscape. Kind of like the profile it had the best. Right, so we're checking our curves, we're checking our histogram. If we want more detail in the land, we need the shadows bringing up. Let's do a little bit of exposure. And somehow we want to bring out and bring attention to these icicles here, right? And they're kind of, there's a lot going on, right? The tree in the background is taking away attention. There's a lot going on down here. So I'm probably going to crop in quite aggressively on this one. And so let's bring the highlights down and we can work on the sky as well. Do we want a little bit more blue in this one? Let's go a little bit more blue, just like that, to make it feel a bit more cooler, right? Like so. And then we're going to do a crop. Okay, so for me, this most interesting part is right here in the middle. Okay, so I would have actually liked if this image was shot the other way. Okay, so here, honestly, is your picture. And when you're doing stuff like this, you really want to watch the background, okay? Because if you had moved a little bit either way, you might have been able to get that tree completely out of the picture. And when you have something like this, the ice, look at how it shows up better against the dark area. Okay, so really focus on that. So I'm going to go somewhere, might even end up with a square, okay, like that. So for me, that's where your picture is. Okay, now that changes everything. Okay, so now we can do things like, let's take a look at Enhance AI. We can do Sky Enhancer, right? So that does a nice job. Accent AI does a nice job as well. See how it's picking up the icicles? So these are great tools to use. And I'm going to add a vignette because I want my eye less on the edges and more on the inside. Okay, so I'm adjusting it. Now keep in mind that I cropped this, right? And this is something that Skylum is aware of. The issue is that because we've cropped, it's not going to, the vignette is not starting at the edges of the cropped image. It's starting at the edges of the original one. So that is actually something that they are working on fixing, because see, if I do it this way, right, the vignette is going this way, but the image is going the other way. Okay. So I'm just going to do subtle edge vignette, maybe brighten in the middle a little bit. Okay. And I still think I could add more blue. It still feels pretty yellow. And then let's bring those icicles out a little bit. Right, now this one's going to be tricky because I only want the icicles. So I'm just going to paint with a small brush and just get the icicles. Okay, because I don't want to pick up any of this background stuff and add structure. Okay, so really tricky. Like that. So I just want the icicles. See how they're brightening? Okay, and because I've done a decent mask on this one, I'm going to copy it. And then we're going to go details, which will give us more of the same. But I only want it on the icicles, so then I can paste the mask. Okay, so if I zoom in, you can see the mask is only there, right? And you can see what it's doing is it's adding detail into those icicles. Now, I mentioned if you go over to the edits panel, because I said the histogram always shows at the top with one exception. When you go back to edits, right, you've lost the histogram. So if we want to go back all the way back here and work on develop, for example, and I want to change the color, but I want to make sure that I'm not clipping anything, that's where your J key comes in, right? I'm going to lower the color. I want to get a little bit less yellow. And highlights. Still clipping the highlights, but I'm not worried about that because it's the bright sun. Okay? And I might scale that vignette back a little bit because I'm looking at it and it looks too dark now. You could actually even go the other way on this one. Yes, I like that better, actually. Now we're working on a soft edge instead and doing a white vignette. I like that better. So it kind of gives it a misty effect. Let's try the one that I wasn't crazy about. Let's try that Atmosphere AI again. It's one that I rarely use, to be honest. Rarely. But let's see what happens. Use a fog. Interesting. Okay, layered fog. That one's coming at the bottom. Okay. Mist. Mist is kind of nice, actually. And haze. So you got to play with the amount and the depth. I kind of like mist. It's kind of softening that contrast overall. I don't mind that. Let's just do it down low. And we could even play with the sun rays on this one. All right. Make sure to put it where the sun is. So the sun is like way down here. Right. And let's warm it up a little bit so it matches the color. There we go. And let's get the sun glowing a little bit more. Now, the neat thing about when you place the sun, right, if I actually place it below the horizon, it should just peek out. It's not doing its job there. Let's try if we put it over here behind the tree. That's kind of cool, right? Now we can just play with the favorite setting, the randomizer. That's kind of neat. See, it's coming down into the icicles, right? So then I can change how much of it comes through. And the overall look. I actually love this slider because if you want a darker look, you go left, lighter, you go right. I actually really like that. Okay, so see what that's doing. And if we only want the sun rays to go down, guess what? We can mask it with a linear mask. And I've done it backwards again. I do this every time, but we can just rotate it. So now they're only going down. It's not going up. So there's our before and after. So I went light. You could also go dark. So I just went one certain way on this image. We could certainly go another way. You know, I went light vignette. We can actually change that. So if we want to go back to dark vignette, okay, and then just revisit some of these other settings. Okay, so now when we have this one, I might want to go brighter. Now that's kind of cool. There we go. How's that? Now we're talking. I'm happy with that. So before and after. See, that sun rays just brings us attention right to there. And if I'm being really honest, your picture, if you really want to focus in on it, is actually here. Okay, so think about your composition when you're cropping, and less is more, right? So you look at that. If you had a really tight version of this, get close. Don't be afraid to get close. I'll just give it a little bit more back to where we had it. And I forget how we had it now. I think I had the whole tree, didn't I? Let's try that. Something like that. I think that's close to what I had. We had more of that. Okay. I could leave it and crop it in Lightroom as well. Yeah, I think the sun rays really added something to that. And how do I decide what tools I'm going to apply is I'm really just sort of playing around and looking at that going, okay, there is the sun there, right? Might there have been a flare? Yeah. Okay, so if the sun had been a little bit higher, Sheila might have actually gotten that appearing in camera, right? So I chose to go dark or lighter on this one, but you could choose to go a different way with it, right? So interpretation is totally in the eye of the beholder and totally up to the photographer, right? So I interpreted it that way. You might do something different, right? If you like the sunset and the icicles are just secondary, then you might go for a darker edit and leave it as a silhouette, right? Could I erase the tree? Yes. Yes and no. Tricky. Let's try it here in Lightroom. In the new Smart Erase tool, which is a content aware tool, it's pretty good, but erasing something that large without having sort of information for it, you're always going to have, it's going to be tricky. Let's just say that. Erasing the tree would be a Photoshop thing, right? So you'd have to do a little bit more work in Photoshop to erase the tree. And that's why I talk about where your feet are when you're photographing, because erasing the tree when you shot it would be much easier if you just moved your feet a couple of steps one way or the other to get a cleaner horizon. Yeah. It was a sunrise. Awesome. Okay, so back to here. Our next week we are going to be doing night photography, and I've got plenty of images, so thanks for that, guys. So if you want to send another night image, you can. I've still got a few more winter ones to hang on to. We still got some people ones. but I'm looking for urban. So that's the ones I'm looking for now. So street and urban. Send us your street, your urbex, your grungy, street stuff, graffiti, whatever you got. That's what we're looking for next. And that is your link to submit your images. So once again, I just want to say thank you all for joining us on sharing part of your Saturday with us, and have a great week. And we'll see you next week when we are doing night photography. Take care.